Good afternoon.
Ms. Lebron-Dykeman, we welcome you this afternoon, and I see you brought some family. If you'd like to introduce them, you're more than welcome to do so.
Well, certainly. Those are my parents, Rosemary and Jim Dykeman.
Welcome. Why don't you give us your opening statement, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice Wiggins and Commissioners. I know the time and energy you've spent in reviewing the materials, doing your own investigations, and or speaking to applicants. It's a Herculean task that you've undertaken in a very short amount of time. So I'd first like to thank you, and I appreciate the efforts you've put into this. I'm sure that some of you are wondering how an IP litigator or intellectual property law litigator who has spent the lion's share of her career in federal court can enhance the Iowa Supreme Court. Hopefully today, I can demonstrate why my unique experiences make me the right fit for this important role. First, I'd like to address how my legal experience fits squarely with the duties required by Iowa's highest court. The Iowa Supreme Court, as you know, is charged with handling the most complex appellate cases, those cases of first impression where there's no precedent to rely upon. Most of my career has been spent litigating patent and trademark infringement cases, where courts must decide whether or not someone has infringed another person's patented invention or caused consumer confusion by using somebody else's brand, logo, or tagline. After spending many years litigating those cases, I have the high-level critical thinking and analytical skills necessary to assimilate the legal and factual issues that are faced by the Iowa Supreme Court, including those issues of first impression. By way of example, I worked on a patent case where the issue was whether a competitor who buys a bag of patented hybrid corn seed to copy the seed's genetics commits patent infringement. Our position was that because the owner of the seed company included language on the seed bag indicating that if you open that bag of seed, you agree to plant the seed only in the ground. When somebody used that seed to copy the genetics, they were committing patent infringement. Because there was no applicable precedent in the patent law area, I had to turn to other areas of law to find relevant precedent. I drew a parallel between the language on the seed bag and the terms and conditions language that's used to prevent copying of software code that we all see every time we download software onto our computers or cell phones. Cases like this, where there's no applicable precedent, no clear-cut law already established, are exactly the kind of cases that the Iowa Supreme Court has to deal with on a regular basis. I'm up to the task of decisively evaluating those cases. Additionally, through my experiences as a judicial clerk, litigator, and adjunct law professor, I have the strong research, writing, and communication skills needed by a justice who's tasked with scholarly research, crafting articulate questions during oral arguments, and writing opinions that are understandable and provide clear guidance to Iowa's other courts as well as Iowa citizens. One thing that makes me unique is that as a trademark litigator, I practice in courts around the country. While all federal trademark cases are decided under the very same trademark law, many courts actually decide those cases and interpret that law differently. So while the law is interpreted differently in Iowa than it is in Illinois or California, for example, because of that, I have developed these very strong research skills, and it's something that I truly enjoy. I'm also used to taking multifaceted subject matter, such as the underlying mechanics for machinery that's used to pre-treat windows before they are painted, and distilling that information down into something that is understandable to anyone, whether or not they have a science or engineering degree. My background as an adjunct law professor and as a former elementary school teacher aids in my ability to make that information understandable to anyone. I do also want to assure you though, that I am not a stranger to state law issues. In fact, while the heart of our cases is certainly the trademark or patent that is at issue, it is a rare case that doesn't also regularly include a number of state law issues, including breach of contract, unjust enrichment, interference with business advantage, misappropriation, and consumer fraud type claims. I've also had exposure to criminal, education, landlord-tenant, and family law matters early in my career through internships at the University of Iowa Law School, my judicial clerkship, and law firms before I joined McKee, Voorhees, and Cease. More recently, I've had occasion to study other areas of state law when assisting a friend with a wrongful death and negligence case, and assisting a local Iowa farmer dealing with eminent domain issues. Still further, while I currently live in Des Moines, I've also had the fortune to work for Iowa citizens all across the state for the past 16 years. One of the joys of my practice is the diversity of my clients. I represent individuals, small family-owned restaurants, larger dairy and agricultural companies, manufacturing businesses, Iowa nonprofits, hospitals, and banks. I've advocated to protect Iowans' rights in their agricultural seed products and machinery, such as grain conveyors, and I've protected business and product names for many Iowans and the mascots for several Iowa educational institutions. I was even able to secure the federal trademark registration for pork chop on a stick. My clients who come from Lamar's to Dubuque to Burlington to Leon and many places in between, and from all walks of life, are both plaintiffs and defendants. I've handled business-to-business disputes and David versus Goliath type disputes between individuals or small businesses against large corporations. I'm confident that just as I've diligently advocated for Iowa citizens for the last 16 years, as a lawyer, I can impartially and fairly adjudicate as a justice for individuals across the state. The fact that I've litigated not only in Iowa courts, but also in courts around the country with different rules and procedures, I believe will be beneficial in carrying out the Supreme Court's administrative duties. I anticipate this will enable me to offer a different perspective when administrative issues arise. I can draw on experiences that I have from other courts and hopefully contribute new ideas to help ensure that Iowa's litigants continue to obtain justice efficiently and cost-effectively despite budget constraints, so that justice remains accessible to all Iowans. On a more personal note, my life experiences as well, I believe, will help me to serve on the court honorably. Although I'm not a native Iowan, I was raised with what I have come to understand are core Iowa values of hard work and being a good neighbor. As far back as I can remember, my parents modeled and taught the value of hard work. Having not received bachelor's degrees before they started raising a family, my father worked days and my mother worked overnight shifts as a nurse. They took turns finishing college, all while raising their family. Their actions portrayed the work ethic they intended to and did instill in all of their children. I began working as a preteen, initially shaping rolls, stocking shelves, and sweeping floors at my grandfather's Italian bakery. My parents also modeled civic responsibility, actively participating in their church and our church, and encouraging us to share our time with others in our community. My civic engagement began as a middle schooler when I volunteered patterning with a young quadriplegic girl in our neighborhood, and has continued throughout my life through activities such as ringing bells for the Salvation Army, volunteering at a shelter for abused women, tutoring elementary school children, taking on pro bono legal work, volunteer and board work at the Iowa Legal Aid, and mentoring young law students and young lawyers. And most recently, working with the book club at the Mitchellville Women's Prison. I assure you that I would put forth all the necessary effort to handle both the intense caseload of the justices as well as the administrative duties with the same work ethic I acquired as a child. Finally, and equally important, I would manage those responsibilities while respecting the lawyers and litigants in the courtroom, the judicial staff, my colleagues, and all Iowans. I humbly request that you pass my name on to Governor Reynolds.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gray, do you have any questions?
You certainly have a very impressive resume. You've had lots of experience. But one of the things I'm concerned or would like to know about is there are a lot of stresses on our rural practitioners. Can you assure me that you have done some thinking about that, how on the Iowa Supreme Court you can help our lawyers who are in the smaller Iowa towns to thrive and do well?
So I have done some thinking about that, Mr. Gray. Thank you for the question. In many respects, I think that is one of the benefits of having represented Iowa clients across the state, because I have some understanding of that. Additionally, I think that my experience on the federal court system will actually be beneficial in ensuring that we try to set up systems that would enable lawyers in small towns to have as much access to the court system as lawyers in the larger metro areas as well. So I would work with the justices on helping to make sure that things like electronic discovery and dealing with e-filing and all of those things would be systems that, you know, I've certainly lived through the highs and lows of those, and would work with justices to try to deal with any of those pains going on, as well as ensuring that there's access to the courts in the local areas.
Thank you.
Mr. Harbaugh? Ms. O'Brien? Ms. Roberts?
Thank you for being here today, and I'm sure that your family is very proud of you as well. As you know, I am from a rural area in Iowa, and one of the concerns that I have is would relate to the administrative role that the Supreme Court has, and I'd like you to talk just a little bit about how can we assure access to citizens in rural Iowa, that they'll have the same access to the court system as if they lived in a city.
Sure. A couple things. One, I think one thing that I'm hopeful that is based on my education background and the notion of educating and teaching, my hope is that we could actually work further with teaching both Iowa citizens and folks on the legislature that the importance of the role that the Iowa courts play, so that the budget cuts wouldn't be as problematic and that there would be more accessible funding to help ensure that there was just access to justice in small communities. And then additionally, the notion, going along the notion of ensuring that while I'd say sort of diversifying resources, so that making sure that when you're in a smaller community, that there is still an open courthouse where there's a clerk that can help folks who may have no access to the internet at home, may not understand the internet. And so if they're doing something like a small claims case and need to engage in e-filing or something to that effect, that there would be a human being that would be in the courthouse to assist.
Ms. Conover?
No questions.
Mr. Bloom?
No.
Mr. Goodman?
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Lebron-Dykeman, I see on our list we've got a couple of lawyers that are federal civil practitioners, you and Ms. Combs, and two that are federal prosecutors. And I actually have two questions that I'm going to combine. I'd like you to address to this commission your background and their backgrounds in federal practice and how that would be applicable to the statewide court system and how that would be an advantage from a perspective standpoint, what you might bring that's new and fresh to the state court system. And in your travels around the United States and in the various courts that you've practiced in, whether they be state courts or federal courts, what have you witnessed in terms of procedures or methods that those courts have used that you might bring to this state court that are not yet adopted in the state of Iowa?
Okay, so a few things. One, with respect to the first question, what benefit might there be in having someone with the federal practice? One, the federal courts have a lot of established procedures with respect to e-discovery, with respect to scheduling orders, with respect to the way certain procedures are run that would, I think, be beneficial. They've been established. They've gone through the pains, the ups and downs of that. And so bringing those kind of things to the Iowa courts as much as it is possible to do. Additionally, with respect to things that I have seen that work really well, one of the things for lawyers and litigators, I think a lot of times, is discovery disputes take up a lot of funding. It takes up a lot of the money that our clients spend in the context of litigation. And some of the judges that I've appeared before that utilize monthly or every other month conference calls that are set up to preemptively deal with any of these discovery disputes. And the way I've seen it done that I think is perhaps most effective is when a judge indicates that they're going to have that monthly conference unless the parties contact them 48 hours in advance to say that there are no issues that are ongoing. And the reason I think that's so effective is because I think lawyers know that if we have to actually explain our position to a court, sometimes it convinces us to be a little more reasonable on the front end.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Sukup?
Thank you. For being in the IP business, you must love detail a lot, and you did make some reference in here of the cost of the engagement of the lawsuits or on that, and then just that most of the times it settles. Is there any, and then you've been in the federal courts quite a bit, so it's a little bit on Jeff's line of, from your experiences there of being able to make the courts responsive to the client's needs, anything from federal to state courts?
I would say a lot of, I would say that a lot of federal courts do push the concept of early mediation. Many courts across the country require you to have early mediation, as soon as the case is filed within the first couple months, and then they periodically suggest it again and again, I think for the same reason that they understand the high cost that the litigants are facing. So they want to try to see if there are other methods of resolution that can get things resolved efficiently.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Dykeman?
Thank you. I appreciate your last comments. I just want to talk a little bit about Mr. Sukup's question, because you talk about the early resolution and some of that assists with costs. Your cases, you may understand, have probably been dealt with lawyers for a long time. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about intellectual property, somebody was involved from the very beginning, from the patent stage, throughout the litigation. Do you understand, and would you explain to us how your experiences may play into Iowa courts, where we'll have litigation, where we'll have somebody come in, say on a state court matter, who may not have had an attorney for a long time, and then there's the suggestion of an early mediation. Do you think that can be helpful, or do you think there's other ways to resolve those issues? So I have had a lot of experience actually representing individuals in cases that are defendants in a case, and so they have not had a lawyer on the front side of that. And in my experience within those situations, they are, when they come to us after receiving a cease and desist letter from someone that owns a patent or trademark saying, hey, you're infringing our rights,
when they come to us, they want to have this resolved as inexpensively as possible. And so they generally find, my experience is they're more likely to want that resolution early on. The folks who have had lawyers for a long period of time, the larger businesses who are used to funding law firms, for the work that they do, they're less inclined to actually want that resolution. So from my perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense particularly with folks who haven't had a lawyer long term.
Thank you.
Ms. Sinclair?
Would you tell us a little bit about your jury trial experience?
Certainly. It was a 3-week-long case that ended with a jury going out at the end of it. It was interesting in the sense of having jurors who, we actually had one juror who we put on the jury, and both parties agreed, and the next day the juror didn't show up, so we had to deal with replacement jurors as well. And I think the thing about it is, to me, the notion that I believe jurors actually spend a lot of time evaluating what's happening. They think this through. I can't speak to what these folks did in the back room because I wasn't there, but from a clerk's experience, I recall walking into rooms and seeing butcher board up all over and people's comments and notes, and the process being a highly, I would say, effective process.
Mr. Bevel?
Nothing.
Dr. Taylor? Mr. Diaz?
I've been debating whether to beat the dead horse here. When I was on the Civil Justice Task Forces, and I don't know how many years ago that was, I recall that we were given numbers in state court and federal court. I believe the numbers were somewhere in the range of slightly more than 1 million cases in state court, and this is Iowa, and something less than 900 cases in the federal system. So justice in the federal system is very different than justice in the state system. The jury trial you talked about, was that in federal court or state court?
That was federal court.
And can you give us an idea of what involvement you've had in the state court system?
Sure. I've had several cases over the years that have been filed in state court that have resolved pretty quickly. I have had one case that went to a bench trial and then up through the appeals court up to the Supreme Court of the state of Iowa. I had a case about 1.5 years ago that was about 2 weeks away from trial when the parties resolved that through mediation. And other cases that have gone, I have one case that's ongoing in state court in Johnson County right now that's taking a long time to go through the system, but that's the parties sort of trying to figure things out themselves as well.
Mr. Berger? Ms. Bowden? Ms. Pearson? I don't think I have any questions either, so I really thank you for coming, and I thank you for bringing your parents, and wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you all.